This is Optimal Finance Daily, episode 438. What I Learned from Interviewing 19 Millionaires, Part 2, by Benjamin Davis with budgetsaresexy.com. And I am Dan, your host, and this is where I read to you from some of the best blogs on personal finance. And today's post, as you guessed from me saying Part 2, is actually a continuation from yesterday. So if you are new here, definitely check out episode 437 first, so today's post makes a lot more sense to you. But if you are all caught up, let's go ahead and hear Part 2 as we continue optimizing your life. What I Learned from Interviewing 19 Millionaires, Part 2, by Benjamin Davis with budgetsaresexy.com. Lesson number 3. Taking risks is a part of wealth building. Quote, I mortgaged my house and didn't tell my wife. She would have killed me if she knew. End quote. I cannot name the guy who told me this as part of our agreement. He said I was the only one he ever told. But for the sake of this article, I will call him A. A was definitely the richest guy I interviewed, even though he didn't reveal how much his net worth was. He also didn't pay for the coffees either. A had a wonderful life. He had the most beautiful girl in town, as he said, and owned 2 paid-off homes by the age of 25, and this was about 50 years ago. Quote, no one had a house back then, only the rich, end quote. I asked him whether he was rich then, and he told me that he only became rich later on, after risking his 2 homes in a matter of months. The story goes that this guy used to run a bike business. Back then, bikes were a true luxury and not many people had them. He would fix and sell bikes for the rich, but he, quote, would never become one in the bike business, end quote. Eventually, the real estate where he had his business was listed for sale. He decided to mortgage his home to buy it. Quote, it was not a smart move at first. My rent was fairly low, so it didn't make sense. I was starving for wealth. It was an impulse buy, end quote. But a few months later, when he sold his business, he became highly aware of the value of that piece of real estate. Quote, the guy who bought my business didn't want to pay me dividends as part of our agreement, so instead I charged him a higher rent on the property I still owned, and he accepted, end quote. A eventually realized he could replicate what he had just done. So he opened another bike business in a nearby town, bought the location from under it, and then listed both the business and the attached real estate for sale. The word spread fast, and A would sell his businesses for small losses, but more than recoup the money from the lucrative rents attached. He's still doing this today, decades later, creating and franchising businesses to owners who then agree to move shops where A wants them to, at his own locations. I remember this story every time I pass by a McDonald's, as they have a pretty similar model as well. Interesting to note that A still owns that first location he rented out, and the bike business is also still there, now run by the second generation of the family. Lesson number 4. Money cannot be sitting in the bank. This is also something I learned from A, as well as most of the other guys. All that A does today in his holdings is making sure that liabilities are never too low and that money is always available. He says, quote, I cringe if debt is too low. There must be something wrong, end quote. But what is really bad, according to him, is money simply sitting in the bank. He says there are 100 reasons to put it to work and not one to hold on to it. I am not sure he didn't overdo it there, as I think holding on to cash can be an intelligent decision too. However, I totally understand why he said that, and that philosophy has worked quite well for him over time. Editor's note. I agree there's nothing wrong holding on to some cash. Not every dollar needs to be maximized. They all have their own place in the equation. End note. Most of the guys I interviewed told me that money is not made to stack up. You can stack it at the top, but it will vanish from the bottom, one of the millionaires said. These guys all lived through high inflation periods, so even those making more money than they could spend understand the power of inflation. Lesson number 5. Working for someone else won't do the trick. The only guy I interviewed who still worked for someone else was a banker, yet he had so many investments and had invested for so long that he could barely keep track of them all. When I asked him why he hasn't left yet, when he obviously can, he said, I like working at the bank. That's why I never quit. Plus, the benefits are great. He's following lesson number 2. All the other guys I interviewed, however, had businesses of their own. Though, to be fair, finding millionaire employees would have been way more complicated to find, so I didn't even try, thinking I wouldn't find many anyway. At the end of the day, most of the millionaires told me that they would have never accumulated so much wealth working for somebody else. Manuel was the biggest advocate of self-employment among the 19. Quote, I did 100K in 1 month and almost $1 million total that year. This was probably in the 1990s. My notes fall short on this, sorry. Tell me a job where I could make that much. I only worked for somebody else when I was 14. I realized that it wasn't for me when I had to deliver the profits at the end of the day and be given only a small portion of it. That made no sense to me." End quote. Manuel went on to say, "Working for yourself is the best thing you can do. No boss, no rules, and no limits." He even told me he felt sorry for some of his employees because they'll never truly understand how much better off they'd be going out on their own. I personally still work for a university where I do research part-time, so I see the merits of working for someone else, especially in what pertains to safety and comfort. However, I want to work entirely for myself after March 2018. My real estate portfolio should yield enough money to employ me by then. Editor's note: I have to disagree here. While it may take longer getting wealthy working for someone else, it's still very much doable. Check out my post on Budgets Are Sexy about the 401k millionaire. You also have to keep in mind that not everyone has the personality or would be good at running their own business. It takes a certain personality along with a whole lot of risk. So if you know yourself well enough that a 9-to-5 is the place for you to be, then keep on rocking it and continue doing your thing. Self-employment can be amazing, but it's not for everyone, nor is it the only path. Lesson number 6, educate yourself financially and on everything else. The first step I took towards becoming financially independent was educating myself by reading tons of books on personal finance. It surprised me that most of the millionaires I interviewed didn't know who Robert Kiyosaki was, whose quote, "If you want to go somewhere, it is best to find someone who has already been there," led me to interview these people in the first place, or even who Warren Buffett was. Side note, if you haven't yet, you should read Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, or check out my own Rich Dad, Poor Dad summary. But it's obvious they educated themselves financially in other ways, like by reading the newspaper every day and learning through their own businesses on how to negotiate, make more money, and ultimately scale. Most of them learned through trial and error. I also noticed how most of them were really curious about how things worked in general. One asked me, "How much do you think this cafe makes every year?" as we were sitting there in it. I didn't know the answer, and neither did he. He was just trying to take an educated guess and fostering discussion, but it showed how his brain worked. During another interview, the guy started asking me so many questions about my own job that it seemed like I was the one being interviewed. So basically, knowledge is key, and it seems that the rich understand this like nobody else. You just listened to part 2 of the post titled "What I Learned from Interviewing 19 Millionaires" by Benjamin Davis with budgetsaresexy.com. And before we go, if you want to help keep this podcast going, we can definitely always use your support. We've got a page set up over at oldpodcast.com/support with a bunch of ways that you can help us out, both financial and otherwise. And it would be great if you could come by and check that out. Again, that's at oldpodcast.com/support. And that is going to do it for today's episode. Have a great rest of your day, everybody, and I will see you in the Thursday show tomorrow, where your optimal life awaits.
Hello, Life Optimizer. This is Justin Malik, creator and producer of this podcast, but also Optimal Living Daily, the show where I read to you from even more blogs covering finance, productivity, minimalism, personal development, and more, from incredible bloggers like Derek Sivers, Zen Habits, Mark and Angel, The Minimalists, and all the ones you hear on this show too. So if you enjoyed today's episode and like taking amazing blogs on the go, come on over to Optimal Living Daily and subscribe to that one too. And together, we'll start optimizing your life.
You've been listening to Optimal Finance Daily. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on each new episode and head to oldpodcast.com. That's OLDpodcast.com for a free gift as well as more actionable tips and resources to help you maximize your potential. Thanks for joining us, and remember, your optimal life awaits.